opens diagonals for bishops and queen, immediately staking a claim in the center and initiating the fight for central control. Initiating the Sicilians' characteristic fight for central influence, challenging White's early pawn advance with a provocative flank thrust. Initiating development and seizing central influence, this knight prepares to challenge Black's promising kingside pawn structure. Unlocking the queen's diagonal and preparing a central pawn push, this establishes a solid pawn structure, albeit a bit passive early on. Cracking open the center, this boldly challenges Black's pawn structure and immediately dictates the game's tactical direction, creating both opportunities and demands for precise counterplay. Opening the d-file for the rook, Black concedes central space but gains an open line for future counterplay. Opening the diagonal for the queen and bishop, White establishes an active piece central presence. Developing the knight to a central square solidifies Black's pawn structure and prepares for a potential queenside pawn push or king's side castling. Developing the knight here prepares kingside castling and contests central squares, aiming for active piece play. Securing the center's central pawn structure, this move fortifies the d-file and prepares for potential pawn advances or piece development on the queen side. Establishing a solid kingside defense and preparing for kingside castling, the bishop now eyes the long diagonal, influencing the center and potentially setting up future kingside pressure or tactical skirmishes by supporting a d4-d5 pawn push. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside castling, this development elegantly supports Black's central pawns while keeping open lines for potential bishop activity later in the game. Securing the monarch is the immediate priority, a wise decision to escape any lurking checks or early attacks along the newly opened diagonals. Developing the king's knight to its most natural square, f6, exerts immediate pressure on the central e4 pawn and prepares for castling, reinforcing the overall development that characterizes Black's early game strategy. A subtle yet powerful piece redeployment, this bishop now shores up the kingside's defenses while simultaneously preparing for future central expansion or kingside pressure. Observe how it subtly influences the d4-e5 diagonal, creating latent threats that Black must respect. Preparing for the queenside expansion with b5, this move gently nudges the kingside knight away from potential central skirmishes, a sensible defensive preparation. Launching forward, f4 aggressively stakes a claim in the center, preparing to expand White's pawn structure and potentially open lines for attack against Black's kingside. This audacious pawn push aims to seize the initiative, though it does create a slight weakness on e3, and the light squares around White's king could become targets if the center opens too quickly. Building a solid defensive structure, Black fortifies the queenside by developing the bishop to its active square, preparing for potential pawn advances and offering support for the c-pawn. Shifting the queen to the e-file prepares a potential kingside pawn storm, perhaps aiming for g4 and h4 to exploit the slightly awkward placement of Black's bishop on d7, which currently obstructs the c8-h3 diagonal and limits development. Challenging White's central control, Black initiates a queenside pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt White's harmonious piece development and gain queenside space, potentially opening lines for the rooks or preparing a future advance with the b-pawn. Opening up a subtle avenue for queenside expansion, this piece repositioning aims to shore up the pawn chain and potentially challenge Black's ambitious b-pawn thrust, all while keeping an eye on the e2 bishop's diagonal. Securing the monarch is paramount, and this castling action addresses that immediate priority, tucking the king away behind a newly formed pawn shield. This maneuver aims to reposition the queen to a more aggressive diagonal, preparing for potential kingside attacks and supporting the advance of the f-pawn, while simultaneously keeping an eye on the b5 square's forward momentum. Pivoting the queen to c7 aims to support the central pawn majority and potentially prepare a kingside pawn storm, while also keeping an eye on the c-file. Displacing the king from the potentially open g-file offers immediate respite, but it also subtly signals a shift in White's focus towards reinforcing their queenside pawns, which have been feeling a bit stretched after Black's persistent queenside expansion. This maneuver, while defensive in spirit, could also be a preparatory step for a more active role on the kingside later, leveraging the now clearer diagonal for potential pieces. Black's decision to position the rook on b8 signifies a crucial preparatory maneuver, aiming to challenge White's queenside pawn structure and potentially activate the b-file for future operations. This move implicitly contests space and prepares for a potential pawn advance on the queenside, adding another layer to the strategic battle for central and flank control. Unleashing a pawn thrust into the center now drastically alters the pawn structure, aiming to rupture Black's harmonious development and open lines for White's pieces, potentially creating dynamic counterplay at the cost of solidifying Black's queenside majority. A bold liberation of the d5 square, inviting potential tactical fireworks as the center opens up, creating a race to exploit the new dynamism. Unlocking the central files hinges on this aggressive pawn thrust. Prepare for a dynamic struggle where the king's safety becomes a paramount concern as Black's queenside expansion is momentarily stalled, forcing a reassessment of their counterplay and potentially creating isolated weaknesses. Black's knight boldly steps into enemy territory, accepting the doubled pawns and opening a direct assault on White's kingside. This aggressive advance challenges White's spatial advantage and injects immediate tactical fireworks into what was shaping up to be a more positional struggle, forcing a crucial decision regarding the central pawn structure and the safety of White's monarch. Unleashing a tactical storm, White sacrifices the rook to rip open the kingside and expose Black's monarch, aiming to exploit the newly created weaknesses before Black can consolidate. The bishop's retreat to f6 offers a vital defensive screen, solidifying the king's immediate surroundings after the knight's aggressive foray. This square allows the bishop to protect the pawn on g7 and simultaneously eye the center, potentially preparing a counterstrike on d4 or e5 should the opportunity arise. It also prepares for potential pawn pushes on the queenside or a regrouping of pieces to better contest the open d-file. Unleashing a bold knight sacrifice, White has aimed to disrupt Black's pawn structure and create dynamic imbalances, now following up by rerouting the bishop to a more aggressive diagonal, aiming to exploit the potential weakness around the castled king and pressure the d6 pawn. Unleashing the queen to b6 offers a dynamic counterplay, directly challenging the White bishop on f4 and simultaneously preparing to exploit the open c-file should it arise. This aggressive deployment aims to disrupt White's seemingly harmonious setup, particularly the queen on g3, and seeks to create immediate imbalances in the position. Unleashing an immediate pawn storm on the kingside, White seeks to disrupt Black's harmony, aiming to shatter the pawn shield protecting the enemy monarch by sacrificing material to open lines. Initiating a pawn confrontation on the e-file now opens up the diagonal for your queen, preparing it for potential maneuvers towards the kingside while simultaneously solidifying the d6 square. The queen's decisive charge into enemy territory, hunting the beleaguered bishop, injects a sharp dose of reality into this Sicilian position, forcing Black to confront immediate tactical threats and potentially sacrificing material to shore up their defenses. Exploiting the pinned knight and the newly opened diagonal, this counterstroke immediately challenges White's queenside structure and aims to disrupt their coordination, potentially forcing concessions or creating an escape route for the trapped knight. Cracking open the queenside pawn shield, White aims to exploit the newly created diagonal for the bishop and potentially open lines toward Black's uncastled king. The Sicilian defense, after a series of exchanges, has led to a complex pawn structure, and Black's decision to push the f-pawn now opens up potential lines for their pieces and aims to dislodge White's imposing bishop on e3, creating a dynamic interplay of forces. Targeting the queen and aiming to disrupt Black's queenside pawn structure, this aggressive maneuver forces a decision and potentially opens lines for White's rooks, hinting at a future assault on the king. A bold gambit to reclaim material, but it sacrifices pawn structure for open lines around the king. The exchange of queens simplifies the position, ushering in an endgame where White aims to leverage their more active pieces and open lines, especially the now potentially dominant d-file, against Black's slightly more cramped structure. The rook now ventures onto the open flank, seeking active play after the queen's departed, and threatening to infiltrate white's territory by exploiting the now weakened queenside pawns. The knight relocates to a more centralized outpost, aiming to exert pressure on black's queenside and prepare for potential breakthroughs. This repositioning seeks to exploit the slight looseness of black's pawn structure around the b4 square. By occupying the c5 square, the knight is poised to either advance further or swing over to the kingside if an opportunity arises. It also offers support for white's d3 pawn, which could become a future target if black isn't careful. White is subtly improving their piece coordination, creating a more cohesive fighting formation for the coming middle-game skirmishes. The intention is to create imbalances and discomfort for the opponent's pieces, forcing them into passive defense. Black repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses on the queenside and preparing to contest the b-file control. Bolstering the king's safety is paramount, especially with the doubled pawns on the f-file posing potential weaknesses. This king shuffle prioritizes defending against any immediate threats on the kingside and prepares for a more secure middle game or potential endgame where king activity can become crucial. The rook on the b-file now finds itself in a precarious position, its escape route through the fourth rank being cut off by white's well-placed bishop, creating a subtle but potent blockade that restricts black's queenside activity. Reclaiming the knight opens up the d-file for potential rook activity, eyeing the pawn on d6, while simultaneously preparing to solidify the kingside defense and eliminate the advanced black bishop. This rook move bravely challenges white's knight dominance and seeks to activate the rook on an open file, potentially aiming to tie down the defending knight or even force a liquidation into a more favorable endgame structure. Challenging the pinned knight with that knight advance seeks to unlock the queenside and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure, aiming to activate your own pieces and prepare for a more dynamic middle game phase by contesting the central squares more forcefully. Securing the b-file for future action against white's somewhat exposed king provides immediate defensive solidity and prepares for potential counterplay. The monarch's trek to the corner, a bold repositioning, prepares to leverage the open files for a more active defense and potentially launch a counterplay on the queenside, while simultaneously reinforcing the central structure against any immediate threats. Securing the monarch offers immediate safety, steering clear of any potential checks along the weakened d-file, and prepares for a more active role in the central skirmish. Activating the rook to the second rank, this maneuver aims to challenge black's centralized pieces and prepare for potential advances on the kingside, subtly probing for weaknesses in the opposing structure while ensuring the rook is ready to redeploy if necessary. Introducing dynamism into a currently static board, this maneuver seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the enemy king, creating activity where little existed. Recapturing the knight strategically repositions a key defender to a crucial central square, enabling control over the d3 and e2 squares, and preparing to contest the open c-file for future action. A desperate gamble emerges, seeking to inject life into a seemingly passive position by forcing a king's reshuffle and potentially opening lines for a later counterthrust down the now open f-file. Relocating the monarch to the center of operations, this strategic repositioning seeks to consolidate defensive posture and prepare for potential pawn advancement, aiming to leverage the open files and establish a more secure sanctuary for the king as the endgame looms. Gaining an open file for the rook with that maneuver significantly increases its attacking potential along the g-file, potentially threatening the white king's safety. Securing the pawn chain and preparing to develop the kingside pawns allows for a more active rook. Unlocking the kingside, this pawn advance aims to create breathing room and potential counterplay, disrupting white's otherwise coordinated pieces and opening avenues for the king to potentially find sanctuary or launch an attack. Positioning the knight to d3 aims to control the vital e5 square and prepare a potential advance on the kingside, subtly reinforcing white's central presence while indirectly eyeing black's somewhat exposed king. Harnessing the open file to pierce white's camp, This maneuver aims to activate the rook and disrupt the harmony of black's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses along the central files that can be exploited later. White's king is stepping into the fray, a bold but potentially precarious maneuver to rally forces and contest the central squares, aiming to disrupt black's queenside initiative and prepare for a more active pawn structure. Unleashing the pawn on the h-file injects immediate, raw aggression, aiming to pry open white's king's shelter before a cohesive defensive setup can materialize. The knight leaps forward, initiating a bold maneuver to seize control of the central squares and potentially launch an attack on black's now exposed king. Unleashing the knight to the center, the rook on the third rank now gains a clear path to pressure the weakened kingside. Opening the h-file drastically alters the complexion of the position, creating immediate attacking potential for white on the kingside. This pawn capture, while seemingly natural, trades off black's active rook for a pawn and grants white a potent open file, aiming to exploit the exposed black king. The exchange sequence that led here, particularly the early pawn sacrifice by black and white's subsequent pressure, has transformed the board into a dynamic battlefield where kingside aggression is now the paramount objective. White's intention is clear: to funnel pieces, particularly the queen and rooks, down the newly opened file to threaten the black monarch, forcing black to constantly react and defend rather than pursue their own strategic aims. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, black aims to exploit the slightly exposed white king and create dynamic imbalances, potentially opening lines for their rook and bishop. The open c-file is now firmly under black's control, a potent avenue for future aggression, especially considering white's compromised pawn structure and lack of active pieces. This position demands immediate attention to solidify defenses rather than simply developing. The immediate threat on the c-file has evaporated, allowing black to shore up the pawn structure with this prudent repositioning of the rook. Activating the knight to d5 opens lines of attack and immediately puts pressure on black's cramped queenside pawn structure. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, black seeks to disrupt white's consolidated position and create attacking chances, aiming to exploit the open files and potentially expose the white king. A decisive fork emerges, splitting black's defenses and threatening a material windfall by hitting both the king and the rook simultaneously. Bringing the king out of its defensive shell offers a chance to participate in the action, but it's a risky gamble with enemy knights eyeing central squares and open lines. Unleashing the knight from its comfortable outpost, this maneuver eyes the weakened c5 square, aiming to disrupt black's centralized rook and potentially exploit the exposed king position. Seizing the open file with the rook offers immediate counterplay, threatening to dismantle white's pawn structure on the queenside and potentially create a passed pawn if white is not careful. Capitalizing on black's misplaced knight, the rook now claims the open file, eyeing that vulnerable pawn on b2 and preparing to penetrate into the opponent's territory. The rook's foray to the third rank galvanizes the pawn storm, creating immediate threats against the exposed white king and potentially opening vital avenues for further infiltration. Unleashing the king into the fray, a bold maneuver seeking to disrupt black's coordinated attack and exploit the open files. A desperate attempt to inject chaos and create counterplay by sacrificing a rook, hoping to overwhelm the exposed white king in the ensuing skirmish. The knight aggressively probes the advanced pawn, forcing black to either defend it or risk losing material. This creates an immediate tactical challenge and compels black to react, potentially disrupting their piece coordination. Embracing chaos, black gambits a pawn for a desperate bid to stir up activity around the white king, hoping to exploit the slightly exposed position. Sacrificing the knight opens a direct attack on the exposed black king, forcing a response that will likely reveal further weaknesses. The black king is thrust into a precarious forward position, a daring gambit to create counterplay, but it risks being exposed to dangerous tactical blows. Initiating counterplay to liberate the pinned knight, this move anticipates black's likely recapture on the g-file and aims to exploit the resulting open avenues. The idea is to force a simplification that might favor white's slightly superior pawn structure, or at least activate the knight to a more dynamic square. Watch for how this knight's repositioning can influence control of key central squares and potentially launch a counterattack on the weakened black king. Opening the file injects much-needed activity for black's rook, aiming to destabilize white's precarious pawn structure. Unleashing a surprising discovered check, white aims to disrupt black's aggressive pawn push by forcing the king into a more exposed position. A sudden shift in the battle for the center, seeking to exploit open lines for the queen. Clearing a path to decisively checkmate the opponent's monarch, this maneuver aims to exploit the fractured pawn structure on the king side and the exposed position of the black king. The king, now feeling the chill of the open files, seeks refuge behind its shattered pawn shield, a desperate scramble for safety as the opponent's knights converge, creating an intricate web of threats. This royal tour, while momentarily disruptive, re-establishes the king's proximity to the action, promising future defensive support and potentially enabling quicker centralization in the unfolding endgame. The king is finally finding a safe haven on the G8 square, escaping the immediate threats and looking to consolidate its position before the endgame unfolds. The knight's repositioning aims to exploit the exposed kingside, creating threats against the weakened pawn structure after the exchange on f4. The pawn chain now aims to secure space on the queen side, potentially setting up further advances to harass white's unified pawns. The knight's repositioning to a more central square aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances against the weakened kingside, although it does concede some initiative to black's advancing pawns on the queen side. Carving out a mating net on the queen side is the clear objective here, as black advances this pawn to create an escape route for their king should the center become too dangerous, while also threatening to expand further down the file. Securing the file immediately prevents black's passed pawn from advancing further and limits the scope of their remaining pieces, forcing them to defend rather than attack. The final pawn lunges forward, desperately seeking promotion, but its path is fraught with peril. Securing the passed pawn, a classic endgame maneuver, solidifies white's advantage by transforming a material gain into a tangible threat. The rook's journey to the first rank heralds a dramatic shift, aiming to infiltrate white's now exposed king. The king's bold excursion towards the queenside aims to intercept the advancing passed pawn, a risky but potentially decisive maneuver to halt black's queenside initiative.